Chapter 2 Midwinter. Since there was no school the following morning, we were free to begin our game of attack and defend early in the day. It was just as well, because it was also midwinter, and there would be a telling once the sun went down. Bala and Jace's team was attacking, so they left the paramount from the south, while Cole and I led our teammates in the opposite direction. Once we reached the place where the stave was still stabbed into the ice, I replaced the maroon cloth I had taken the previous day. After finishing, I turned to the others and began reviewing our strategy. It was more challenging to win when playing the defense. If any member of the opposition made it through our ranks and got a hold of the cloth, we would lose. Our only hope for victory was to catch every member of the other team. Once we tagged them, they would be immediately removed from the game. After the allotted amount of time had elapsed, if the token hadn't been secured or the attacking team hadn't all been captured, the game would end in a draw. I hated draws. It was just as bad as losing. "Maybe we should all stay here and ambush them," Rasby suggested. "Won't work," I countered, shaking my head. "Bala's smart. She doesn't want to lose. I bet she'll have a few players hang back. That way, even if she doesn't win, we won't either." Cole nodded. "Bala's used that ploy in the past." Technically, Jace was just as much of a team leader as Bala, but most of the time I thought of it as solely Bala's team. Jace might have been older and more experienced, but everyone knew who was really the brains of the outfit. "We'll need at least 2 groups to go and hunt for them," Cole continued. "Tierra and Tyria?" I suggested, hoping to get the annoying pair as far from me as possible. "If you don't mind," Cole added, glancing at the sisters. The pair exchanged a long look, as though speaking without words. Both girls were good at moving along without being seen. They weren't particularly fast, but they worked well as a pair and could use that to ensnare the enemy. In unison, the girls turned to us and nodded. A young, lanky boy, who had joined our team only a few days ago, volunteered to go with them. We sent 3 more of our teammates in the other direction. After circling the paramount, the 2 groups would eventually meet up on the far side of the village. The rest of us would spread out and hide ourselves along the mountainous drifts of white powder. The very worst part of being the defenders was the waiting. Even sitting in the sun, wrapped in my cloak, I could still feel the chill of the snow all around me. The game was supposed to end at sun high, giving Bala's team 2 hours to pick a strategy and recover the cloth. They took their sweet time. It wasn't until after the first hour had completely elapsed that I finally saw some movement. 3 maroon-clad figures were coming our way from the west. Judging by height, the one in the middle had to have been Jace. The identities of the other 2 I couldn't make out. Instantly, I suspected a trap. If those 3 were approaching from the west, then there had to be others coming from the east or south. I slipped over to where Cole was concealed. "We've got him coming," I reported, pointing to my right. "Want me and a few others to go check it out?" he asked. "All right," I said, "but don't take too many. They're probably meant to be a distraction." Cole called Motik, a tall boy of 15, and Ashlow, a girl several months younger than I was, to join him. They were 2 of our most athletic players. Stealthily, the 3 began creeping toward the approaching figures. I gathered the rest of our team, Rasby and 2 others. We moved to the southeast side of the stave and took cover behind a low snowbank. It was a dangerous way to play, leaving the cloth so unprotected, but luring the enemy in was our only chance at true victory. Nothing moved in front of us. I pricked up my ears, but there was not a sound to be heard save the bated breath of my teammates. Suddenly, a cry from Cole's direction rent the air. Without hesitation, I broke cover and raced toward the stave, calling for the others to follow. We arrived just in time. It looked like Bala's entire team was bearing down on us. Bala was inches from the maroon cloth, her hand stretched forward, reaching for victory. I leapt toward her, and would have caught her before she could free the cloth from its tether, but she shoved one of the younger members of her team into my outstretched arms and fled. "No fair," he whined, twisting free of my grasp. With a pouting demeanor, he went to sit in the snow a little way off, the first of his team to be captured. "Don't get too far from the token," I instructed my teammates. "They'll try to tempt you away. Don't let them." Even while I was giving instruction, Bala had rallied her team, and they charged us again. We were hard-pressed to keep them at bay. We wouldn't have been able to hold out very long, just the 4 of us, but a minute later, Cole, Motik, and Ashlow returned. The wave of reinforcements caused a great deal of confusion in the enemy ranks, and 3 more of Bala's team were caught. Now that the numbers weren't so uneven, it was easy to keep them away from the token, but my instinct was to try to catch them. We had less than an hour left. and if we didn't begin picking them off soon, we would give up our chance of victory. Our team had formed a tight ring encircling the stave, while the opposition huddled around their leaders, probably preparing for another assault. Cole came to stand beside me, eyes never leaving the enemy. "You were right," he told me. "It was a diversion." As soon as we got close to that group, the rest of them popped up between us and the stave. It was all we could do to yell before they were on top of it. "Nicely played, Bala," I muttered. She had almost won with the sudden charge. "Guess we'll have to chase them down one by one," Cole sighed. I nodded. It was never much fun when everyone was out in the open. Plus, the likelihood of either team winning was all but non-existent. Even so, we dedicated almost 40 minutes to trying to catch all the members of the other team. Rasby was useless when it came to running, and one of the other girls was too young to do much good. However, the rest of us took turns charging the opposition. By the time midday rolled around, we had only managed to catch about half of them. Most disparagingly, the game ended in a draw. "We'll have to play again tomorrow after school," Bala said, as we headed back to the village together. I nodded in agreement. "Should we mix up the teams a little?" Cole asked. "Jace and I could be interested. Make us an offer we can't refuse." Bala's eyes turned toward Motik and Ashlow. "I don't think that's going to happen," I interposed quickly. Knowing Cole, he would trade away half our team just to give Bala and Jace a chance to win. The teams had been formed a long time ago. Traditionally, the two oldest players were co-captains. The teams took turns adding to their ranks when new kids were old enough to join. Trades could be made either for a short amount of time or permanently. In the past, the teams had sometimes turned out lopsided, with one team far better than the other, but for the most part, our teams were evenly matched. After parting ways with the others, I reached my empty dwelling. The only person I lived with was my mother, Myra, for whom I was named, and she was not there. I assumed she was with the council, making plans for the telling that night. Even when we were both inside the dwelling, it still felt empty. The place had not been a home to me since my father, Rilke, had died 11 years ago. Most days, I didn't even think of his absence, but every once in a while, the sharp pain of his passing would flare up again. Somehow I knew it would never completely fade away. Some wounds couldn't be healed, and some things had to be carried forever. I couldn't actually recall his face completely, and each year I lost a little more of the fragmented image. All I had left was an impression of his warm eyes and joyful smile. The things I remembered most about his character, the love and gentleness he had always shown me, were a far cry from Mina's frigid demeanor. One day, 3 years after my father's death, when I was 8, I had fallen out of a tree and broken my arm. The tree had grown on the outskirts of the Paramount, where the buildings ceased and open fields began. Several other children had been climbing the tree too, but I had made it the highest. I had kept going even when the branches had grown thin and weak. I had wanted to show them that I was the best. To that end, I had climbed so high that none of them had dared to follow. I could still remember the horror of feeling the branch snap beneath me and the terror of plunging to the ground. The fear, more than the pain, was what had brought tears to my eyes. I had known something was wrong because, when I had finally caught the breath the fall had knocked out of me, I hadn't been able to move my left hand. I had started screaming, and Cole had run back to the Paramount for help. It had felt like forever that I had sat there under the tree, my broken arm cradled to my chest, with a small group of children huddled around me, unsure of what to do. When Mina had arrived, instead of coming to my side and holding me in her arms like I had wanted, she had just stood there, examining me with her cold, gray eyes. I remembered reaching my good hand out to her, but even then she had not taken a single step forward. Instead, she had turned to Cole and had sent him to find a healer. I had continued to scream and sob until the healer, Gretch, had arrived. He had glanced at Mina, as if he hadn't been able to understand why she hadn't approached me. The moment she had finished explaining the situation, she had left, deserting me to the care of a stranger. That was the day I had stopped turning to others for help. If my own mother didn't care enough to aid me, why should anyone else? I decided then that I would survive by myself or not at all. I never asked her for anything after that, and I refused to even think the word mother of her in my mind. I began calling her Mina, and she did not appear to notice the change. She was the second clan leader, the second most powerful person on the council. From the outside, I'm sure people only saw her as one of the great leaders of the clan. For nearly 50 years, Mina had held the same position. There were few who could remember a time before her appointment. The obligations of leading the clan kept her busy, and I had my friends in school, so there was little chance of interaction between us. It was for the best. When we were together, it just made her rejection of me that much harder to bear. Until the telling began, there was little enough for me to do. I busied myself cleaning the main room of the dwelling. Every day, rations of wood and food were delivered to each family. Since neither Myra nor myself were around much, we used very little of the supplies, and they tended to pile up. I restocked our scant indoor woodpile. The firewood ration from the past couple of days had begun to pile up outside, threatening to block the door. I lit some kindling to try to warm the room. The previous night's fire had died, and it was practically warmer outside than in. The fire was made in our stove, a big black box with a pipe attached to one of the dwelling's exterior walls. It served as both a place to cook our meals and a heater for the entire dwelling. The 2 wooden shelves where our food rations were meant to be stored had been completely full for months. The extras had overflowed onto the table, still sitting in their crates. From the stench, I knew some of the supplies were rotten. I picked through and separated the putrid-smelling perishables into an empty crate. Once full, I hauled it outside, where it would be collected and disposed of when the new food rations arrived in the morning. It took most of the afternoon, but eventually the dwelling was spick and span, aside from the table filled with extra ration crates. As evening fell, I cooked myself some dinner. Generally, I just ate whatever happened to be lying around, but that day I hadn't had lunch, so I took the time to bake a little bread, roast some meat, and even boil a potato for myself. After devouring the little feast, I cleaned everything up and set out for the telling. It was almost completely dark, and the temperature had dropped drastically. Thankful for my fur-lined winter boots, I trudged through the deep drifts, wrapping my cloak tighter around my shoulders. Soon I made it to a path that had been packed down by many feet, all going in the same direction. I saw others along the road, each bundled in a cloak similar to my own. Our destination was the same, the amphitheater. It lay just outside of the Paramount. As I drew nearer to my destination, the crowd around me thickened until I could no longer see the hard-packed snow of the path before me. My view was limited to the multicolored splash of different cloaks ahead of me. Some were the same maroon-red as mine, but most were different colors, representing all 9 of the different villages. The Paramount was located in the very center of the land of the clan. It was where the council members, the scribes, and the clerks lived with their families. Out of all the villages, ours was the smallest, but we carried the greatest responsibility. Night had fallen by the time I reached the amphitheater. The 20,000 members of the clan were almost entirely assembled. The normally short trek had taken twice as long because of the great press of people. When following the northern road out of the Paramount, the path was level and straight, but the land at the southern end dropped away into a small hill once you left the village. The amphitheater rested on the eastern ridge of the rise. Spectators sat on the slope, facing away from the Paramount and looking down toward the wide field beyond. The seats were long slabs of rock forming huge semicircles, each tier with fewer stones than the one before it as they proceeded down the hill. The last semicircle, the smallest, rested on flat ground. A wooden rectangular structure, a few feet taller than me, made the stage. The black night behind the platform was a perfect backdrop of darkness. There were 4 vacant chairs set up in the center of the stage and several dozen more lined up along the back. A huge bonfire blazed in the great fire circle between the seats and the wooden stage. A huge bonfire blazed in the giant fire circle between the seats and the wooden stage. It illuminated the entire space with dancing crimson flames. The fire's heat reached almost to the top rows of the amphitheater, but still, the family seated in the back huddled close together. In all my 16 years of life, I couldn't remember any night as cold as this one, and I had no family to give me warmth. Myra would be on the stage with the other council members. As usual in this kind of situation, I searched the crowd for a familiar face, looking for someone I knew well enough that I would be comfortable grafting myself into his or her family for the evening. I didn't really have many options. The first person that I recognized was Rasby. I enjoyed her company in general. Most of the time, she was relaxing and easy to be around. With Rasby, it really didn't matter what I did. Even if she left crying one day because of something I'd said, she would still come back the next, ready to make up. However, I would have preferred to sit with Cole. His father was the first clan leader, the only person more important than Myra. Because of our parents' positions, we had been thrown in together a lot. It was good for us to be seen together. It showed the unity of our families and of the clan. I descended several rows, scanning the crowd in the dim firelight for maroon forms that might be either Cole or a member of his family. Rasby turned suddenly and saw me. She waved and our eyes met. I sighed resignedly, knowing I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen her. Shoving my way through the assembly, almost to the very front row, I dropped onto the icy stone beside her. Rasby smiled brightly at me. Her blotchy complexion was redder than usual from the excitement, and her frizzy hair had been freed from the braids. Our appearances couldn't have been more different. I had straight brown hair, which I almost always tied back in a ponytail. My eyes were a clear gray instead of a muddy brown. I had skin that was tan and flawless. People often said that I looked fierce. No one would ever say that about Rasby. On the seat beside her, I was close enough to the bonfire to feel the heat from the flames. I enjoyed the sensation and closed my eyes for a moment, pretending that it was summer and the sun was shining down on me. I loved the summer. Winter always felt dark and depressing. It was nice, even for just a fleeting moment, to bask in the warmth of a pretend sun. My revelry was interrupted by Rasby. "It's so cold, Myra," she squealed, leaning closer to her father, who was sitting on her other side. "I hope they cancel. Do you think they will?" she asked. "No," I said. "They never cancel. It's midwinter, and we can't break tradition. They have to tell us the history of our people, no matter how cold it gets." Rasby pouted slightly. She was the youngest of 4 and the only girl. It tended to make her rather spoiled. She didn't like to be uncomfortable, and was used to letting other people, including myself, handle problems for her. Most of the time, I didn't mind too much, but it was frustrating that she couldn't seem to do so many simple things herself. I glanced at the stage. What Rasby had said was true. It was bitter cold. From the number of people crowded into the amphitheater, it appeared that even those from the most outlying villages had arrived. Soon the telling would begin. Privately, I was hoping to hear something other than the history of the clan, which was told twice a year, at midwinter and midsummer. Rasby and I did not speak again. She was clearly unable to think of anything beyond the chilly wind that buffeted us, and I was lost in my own thoughts. Mostly I was caught up in the hope that the trials would be announced that evening. The thought had been growing on my mind every year since I had turned 12. The trials only took place once every 50 years, but I knew they were due again in the next decade. I just hoped they wouldn't come too late. After several more minutes the amphitheater was completely packed, with hardly enough room to fit everyone. The entirety of the clan had assembled. There were some soft murmurs from among the seated people, but the majority were silent, like me. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, and we waited. I was focused forward, watching the flames lick the logs. The ruby patterns on the wood were mesmerizing. Finally, the time came. It could have been minutes or hours later for all I remembered, but at last, Cole's father, stepped onto the empty stage and waited for silence to fall before he addressed us. The crowd hushed almost immediately. Cor, who was approaching 70, was a hunched man with shoulder-length white hair. He wore thick pants, such a dark red that they almost looked black from where I was sitting. On top of that, he had a bulky maroon coat, several shades darker than mine, trimmed with white fur. Despite his age, his voice still rang out loud and clear as he spoke. "Greetings to the clan," he called, not in the common tongue, but in the high language, a second language that we were all taught but rarely used in day-to-day life. It was reserved for special occasions. We called ourselves the clan because we were a perfectly structured society. There were long lists of laws that dictated how best to live our lives in perfection and peace. I didn't like all of the rules, but I always understood that their design was to keep everyone safe and all things well ordered. "Greetings," we replied to Cor in the high language. It was incredible to hear 20,000 voices speak one word at exactly the same moment. Cor smiled. He must have felt our unity. Even from a distance I saw his eyes all but disappear into the wrinkles of his face. Unlike Mina, Cor was a warm, joyful person. He often left the council meetings early, and rarely traveled to the other villages of the clan. Instead, he preferred to spend the time with his family. I'd often wished that he had been my parent instead of Mina, but that would have meant giving up the little bit of memory I still had of my father. I wasn't sure it would have been worth it. Other than Cole, who was 18, all of Cor's children were much older than I was, most living in other villages with families of their own. Cole must have been a surprise to his parents, since he'd come 15 years after his last brother. Normally, on midwinter, Cor would launch excitedly into the history of our people after greeting us, but not that night. That night his words were even and rehearsed. However, I sensed that under his facade, great emotion churned. "It is time for the 6 months of preparations to begin," he said, speaking in the common tongue. There was dead silence. I closed my eyes and smiled as Cor continued. "The trials will be held this coming year."